History tells the story of the world and of our lives. Sometimes that history goes bump in the night. Broadcasting from the center of oddity and the supernatural in Central Florida, it's the History Goes Bump podcast.
Hello, you spooktacular people. Welcome to this 578th episode of the History Goes Bump podcast, Ghost Tours for the Theater of the Mind. I am your host, Diane.
And this is Kelly.
Kelly, on this episode, we're doing another one of our Life and Afterlife. I love those, as do the listeners. And this is probably my most favorite founding father, Benjamin Franklin.
Looking forward to bringing this to the listeners.
Anybody got a kite?
Let's go fly a kite.
It was windy the last couple of days.
It certainly was. It would have blown us away. I don't know that we would have gotten electrocuted or anything like that. But before we get into that, we want to welcome into the Spooktacular crew, Linda, Janet, and Tammy with a Y.
Thank you so much for joining our Facebook group.
And now, this moment in Oddity.
One of the most basic cakes ever made is the pound cake. The oldest recorded recipe for pound cake was in Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy in 1747. While most people might think the etymology of pound cake is due to the weight of the sweet treat, the name is actually related to the quantity of its ingredients. 1 pound of flour, 1 pound of eggs, 1 pound of sugar, and 1 pound of butter, and some salt. Not 1 pound of salt, however.
That would be a lot of salt. I'd be like, water? Could I have some water, please?
This staple of family gatherings and picnics would be quite dense using that recipe. The basic recipe has remained the same since 1747 and has endured probably because of the simplicity of the recipe. It was easy to remember for those who could not read or write. The pound cake originated in Britain and was so popular that the recipe quickly migrated to the colonies of America, with the first recorded recipe in 1754 being attributed to Wicomico Church, Virginia. The original recipe started mutating in the 1800s, eventually adding ingredients to make it less dense and heavy. Ingredients like baking powder, milk, buttermilk, sour cream, and vanilla have lightened the load of this dessert staple. Not only has the cake become lighter over the years, but the additional ingredients give the dessert a moist and tender texture. The fact that pound cake didn't acquire its name due to its weight or how much it costs, but rather to the uniform individual weight of nearly all the ingredients, and that formula actually worked, certainly is odd.
This history podcast is haunted.
And now this month in history.
In the month of March, on the 7th in 1923, Robert Frost's poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, was published. Frost had been born in California, but after his father died when he was 11, his mother moved him with her to Massachusetts, and thus he would always be associated with New England. He graduated valedictorian from his high school and went on to attend Dartmouth and Harvard, but didn't finish a degree. He married Eleanor White, and the couple decided to try their hand at running a New England farm. They added 4 children to the mix and struggled in poverty for nearly 20 years. Feeling utterly depressed, Frost moved the family to England in 1912, and he tried his hand at poetry. He published a collection of them as A Boy's Will in 1913. World War I brought the family back to America, and they settled on a New Hampshire farm while Frost continued to write. The American public fell in love with his poetry, and Frost went on to read some of it at the inauguration of President John F. Kennedy. He lectured at universities and received 44 honorary degrees, so who needs to graduate from college anyway?
Indeed.
This particular poem was very popular, and the last stanza, "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep," has been interpreted by some to be representative of death, while others see it as an appreciation of nature. Robert Frost did finally sleep in 1963.
Benjamin Franklin was a little bit of everything: inventor, diplomat, statesman, author, publisher, a founding father, and a bad boy. He helped guide America through the growing pains of becoming a constitutional republic, guiding its own destiny separate from Great Britain. Philadelphia became his home, and the caretaker of the cemetery where he was buried in that city once said, "If Ben Franklin haunts the city and streets of Philadelphia, he haunts it with his personality and his invention." And it might seem that he haunts a couple of places with his actual spirit as well. Join us for the history and hauntings of Benjamin Franklin.
Benjamin Franklin ran away to Philadelphia when he was 17, seeking a new life. When Franklin arrived in Philly, the city was coming into its own as a force in learning and culture. One of the largest libraries in the colonies had just been created. The city declared itself a place of religious tolerance as well, which brought people from many religions. Immigrants from Ireland and Germany flooded into Philadelphia during the 1720s and 1730s. For his part, Franklin would be a gift for the growing city. His life began in Boston, though. He was born on January 17, 1706, and while his father desired for him to get a good education, the family wasn't well off and didn't have the money, so Franklin only went to school until he was 10 years old. There were 17 children in the Franklin household, and Ben's dad worked as a candle and soap maker, so you can see why they didn't have a lot of money. It's a lot of kids.
Good grief.
And it was between two women, so they both had a lot of children. Benjamin supplemented his education with books. He was a voracious reader. James's brother worked as a printer, and he had Franklin come work with him, and he taught him about printing. James would found the third newspaper Boston would have. Franklin had a desire to be published, and he asked James to print a letter he wrote. James refused, and so Franklin came up with an idea very similar to Lady Whistledown of Bridgerton. We love her, don't we?
We sure do.
His Lady Whistledown was a middle-aged widow named Silence Dogood. Many of, quote-unquote, her letters were published and captured the imagination of Boston. Everybody was talking about Silence Dogood's opinions. James was not happy when he discovered that Silence Dogood was actually his little brother Benjamin. Shortly after that, Franklin left for Philly, but I'm not quite sure how they worked this out back then. Since he was under an apprenticeship to James and didn't tell James he was leaving or ask his permission, he became a fugitive.
Whoa.
I guess when you were an apprenticeship to somebody, you weren't free to do what you wanted to do.
Even when you're family.
Exactly.
Since Ben knew printing, he found work in several print shops. The governor of Pennsylvania convinced Franklin to sail over to London to get some new print equipment to start a newspaper. But apparently the governor was full of crap, and Franklin found himself in London with no way to get home. With the help of an English merchant that he worked for, Franklin was able to return to Philadelphia 4 years later. He was 21 at the time and started his journey of enriching Philadelphia by forming the Leather Apron Club, which was also known as the Junto. This was a group of tradesmen and artisans and was meant to mimic the Enlightenment groups that met at coffee houses in Britain. The Junto created a library by contributing their own books, and then Franklin expanded on that by starting a subscription library so that they could raise more funds to buy more books. Franklin wrote of this endeavor, "I made a proposition that since our books were often referred to in our disquisitions upon the inquiries, it might be convenient for us to have them all together where we met, that upon occasion they might be consulted, and by thus clubbing our books to a common library, we should, while we liked to keep them together, have each of us the advantage of using the books of all the other members, which would be nearly as beneficial as if each owned the whole." In 1731, Franklin wrote the charter for the Library Company of Philadelphia. A couple years before that, Franklin became the owner and the publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette. He continued his practice of writing under pseudonyms.
Franklin brought his Enlightenment values and another pseudonym to his next big endeavor, which was Poor Richard's Almanac, a booklet of information about weather and household tips with some proverbs thrown in for good measure. The most widely known was, and I say this to myself all the time, I love it because this is exactly what I do, Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. I don't know if it's made me wealthy, and I don't know how wise I am, but I do feel healthier. He published that every year from 1733 to 1758. And this is a man who studied weather patterns, the currents of the ocean. I mean, he was way ahead of his time with all of this stuff. In 1753, there were 15 English newspapers published in the colonies, and Franklin published 8 of them with a couple of his printing partners, one of whom was one of the first female printers, Elizabeth Timothy. Very early in his time in Philly, Benjamin joined the local Masonic Lodge, and he worked his way up to Grand Master by 1734. He remained a lifelong Freemason. And as we know, a lot of the founders were that, and that's why a lot of the designs and symbolism around America have Freemasonic origins. We should do an episode about that at some point, all the Freemasonic symbolism. Wonder if listeners would be interested in that.
The main woman in Franklin's life would be Deborah Reed, the daughter of his landlady. He first met her when he was 17 and she was 15. He asked her mother if he could marry Deborah, and she said no. While he was in England, Deborah married another man who eventually abandoned her, and his fate was unknown, so she couldn't divorce him.
And he took her entire dowry when he went, so he basically married her for the money and took off.
Cad.
Mm-hmm.
When Franklin returned to Philly, he took up with Deborah again, but they couldn't marry due to bigamy laws, so they lived together in a type of common law marriage. They had 2 children, a son named Francis Folger Franklin, born in 1732.
There's that alliteration you love.
Always. And a daughter named Sarah Franklin, born in 1743. Francis died from smallpox at the age of 4 because his mother wouldn't allow him to be vaccinated. At some point before the relationship with Deborah started, Franklin had a son out of wedlock named William. Franklin got around.
Yeah, this is actually before he was getting around. He is definitely going to get around later.
Franklin did claim him and never revealed who the mother of William was, and he and Deborah raised him. Despite Franklin eventually becoming a founding father, his son William was loyal to Britain and served as colonial governor for New Jersey from 1763 to 1776. After the Revolutionary War, he ran to Britain and died in exile.
I thought that was kind of sad. That clearly destroyed whatever relationship they might have had. Benjamin would travel to Britain and other parts of Europe through the years, and Deborah never joined him because she was afraid of the water. This freed him up for frivolity in Britain at places like the Hellfire Club. Before we get into talking about that, for those of you who listened to our paranormal conversation that was just posted on Tuesday, the Hellfire Club came up when I was interviewing Adam, because he's been to the one that's in Dublin. I should say it like he would say it, Dublin. And so when I was researching this, of course, with Benjamin Franklin, and I already knew that he wasn't a member of, we'll talk about that in just a minute, but he would go there all the time. And so I was like, oh, wow, how weird that Adam had brought up the Hellfire Club and an experience he had there. And then here we are talking about Benjamin Franklin.
Well,
to it.
Synchronicity. It happens all the time. I don't know why you'd be surprised, honestly.
And the cool thing is I have this great Haunted Ireland. It's like a picture book almost, but it has ghost stories in it too. Tarquin Blake, I think is how you say the author's name. And so it has these really cool pictures of the one that's in Dublin. And in this, he writes that the club was founded in May 1735 by Richard Parsons, the first Earl of, I think it's Rossi. He had earlier been the first Grand Master of the Irish Freemasons for a period of 6 years. So you can see how there's the crossover there with the Freemasons, and that would be why Benjamin Franklin would come over here. He had written a book, Dionysus Rising, based on these scrolls that he had found, and went on to found a society called the Sacred Sect of Dionysus that vigorously celebrated the joys of Bacchus, wine, and Venus, sex. When his Sacred Sect of Dionysus disbanded, he then founded the Dublin Hellfire Club. And any records of membership in that are very scant. They sometimes met at this Eagle Tavern on Cork Hill, but then, of course, they ended up moving into this place that, I think I have a picture of it on the front. It kind of looks a little bit like, almost like a mission.
Yeah,
kinda,
it does.
I would say. It's got an interesting look to it. But it's definitely very, very old. And there were numerous sightings of large black cats in the Mount Pillier area, and so they have a lot of ghost cats that like to hang out here. And there was even this story that there was this menacing devilish apparition that was seen to transform into a giant black cat, leaving 3 witnesses absolutely terrified.
Oh.
And then there's another story about this Dublin Hellfire Club that members kidnapped, murdered, and gruesomely ate a farmer's daughter in 1740.
Oh, my word.
So it was quite the crazy place. But I just thought, how very synchronistic that we're going to be talking about the Hellfire Club here with Benjamin Franklin, and also Adam had actually been to the one that was in Dublin. And as I'd said, he was never a member, but his good friend, Sir Francis Dashwood, was, and he would invite Franklin to come on over for the debauchery that included drinking, gambling, and orgies.
Woohoo.
People also suggested that the club practiced occult rituals, and of course, they paid homage to the gods Bacchus and Venus, as you just heard I'd read there. Members danced in fancy clothes and often dressed as biblical characters.
Oh, my word.
The club motto was, and you'll have to excuse me because this is French, I believe, so I don't speak French.
You're excused.
Fais ce que tu voudras, which actually translates to do what thou wilt, which probably sounds familiar to those of you who know a little bit about Aleister Crowley, because he adopted that same motto. And you've probably heard it from Satanists as well, do what thou wilt. The Hellfire Club started in the former Medmenham Abbey, but eventually moved to the caves at West Wickham, starting in the 1750s. The club was no longer active by the mid-1760s, and legends claim that the caves remain haunted to this day. One of the spirits here is said to belong to a young maid named Suki, who was accidentally killed in the caves. That's all we know about that. And the former steward of the club, Paul Whitehead, is also said to haunt the caves. And speaking of the debauchery and Franklin being over in Europe, he obviously took a lot of advantage of the fact that his wife didn't come with him. One of the things that he wrote is, behind every great man stands a woman, and behind every great nation there are wise and courageous women who shape its destiny. So he did think highly of women. He just really enjoyed their beauty and
company.
Other things. There were times that he would be in Paris, and he formed close relationships with several French women. He had a rumored love affair with Madame Helvetius. She was a widow known for her intelligence and beauty. His popularity even extended to Queen Marie Antoinette. Now, they didn't have any kind of an affair with each other, but she reportedly nicknamed him l'ambassadeur électrique, I guess. Again, I don't speak French. The electric ambassador, for his magnetic personality and electric breakthroughs. Hopefully that's all she thought was electric about him. He also wrote saucy letters to Madame Brilliant of Passy. She was a talented French musician and socialite. They began a friendship by writing letters with witty and flirtatious correspondence. They had a lot of rich exchanges of ideas, including Franklin's suggestion that she take up his air bath routine, in which one should sit naked in the morning, allowing the fresh, cool air to encircle the body. And I'm sure he wanted to help her with that.
Good grief.
We don't know the full extent of that relationship. It's possible that things did get physical, or maybe not. He also had affectionate letters with a woman named Elizabeth Graham Ferguson when he was an older, much older man, and she was a younger woman. In his letters, Franklin addressed her as his dear and much esteemed friend, revealing a more tender and romantic side to him. And it is believed that that relationship remained platonic. So he definitely liked to have friendships with women, some of which may have gone a little bit beyond the bounds of friendship.
Part of the reason why Franklin would go to Europe was due to politics. He became very active in civics and served as a representative of the Pennsylvania Assembly starting in 1751. He would be elected Speaker of the Pennsylvania House in 1764. Franklin also organized the Pennsylvania Militia and helped to get a city hospital built. He also set his sights on education and helped create and open the Academy of Philadelphia in 1751. This eventually grew into the University of Pennsylvania, which changed its name in 1791. And he started the postal system in the colonies. The British appointed him Postmaster of Philadelphia in 1737, and eventually he became Joint Postmaster General for all the American colonies in 1753. The British would fire him in 1774 because he seemed a bit too supportive of non-Tory interests.
You think?
Just a little bit.
Yeah, he's definitely going to get those sentiments. Benjamin was also an inventor, and we have many modern-day conveniences that got their start with him. He invented the lightning rod and said of it, "May not the knowledge of this power of points be of use to mankind in preserving houses, churches, ships, etc., from the stroke of lightning, by directing us to fix on the highest parts of those edifices upright rods of iron made sharp as a needle. Would not these pointed rods probably draw the electrical fire silently out of a cloud before it came nigh enough to strike, and thereby secure us from that most sudden and terrible mischief? I'd call it a little bit more than mischief. It's alive!
Watch yourself there, Madam Frankenstein.
There are some common misconceptions with his kite experiment. Some claim he discovered electricity. That was discovered long before this. The kite also wasn't struck by lightning, or Franklin would have probably been electrocuted. Ben described his kite experiment in this way, and I hope he doesn't mind that I'm being a little informal with him like he's my friend, but I think since I'm a woman, he would have been okay with that. As soon as any of the thunderclouds come over the kite, the pointed wire will draw the electric fire from them, and the kite, with all the twine, will be electrified, and the loose filaments of the twine will stand out every way and be attracted by an approaching finger. And when the rain has wet the kite and twine so that it can conduct the electric fire freely, you will find it stream out plentifully from the key on the approach of your knuckle. At this key, the file may be charged, and from electric fire thus obtained, spirits may be kindled, and all the other electric experiments be performed, which are usually done by the help of a rubbed glass globe or tube, and thereby the sameness of the electric matter with that of lightning completely demonstrated. And now a little break for a word about one of our sponsors.
Franklin also invented bifocal glasses. The Franklin stove, which provided more heat with less fuel, the glass harmonica, which was a musical instrument, and the urinary catheter.
I don't know how thankful we are for that, but I know it has come in handy for me a couple of times when I've been in the hospital, so I guess we're thankful.
Stones. He never filed for any patents for any of his inventions, saying that we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, and we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours. And this we should do freely and generously.
There's a lot of inventors out there that have gotten rich off their patents that are going, you fool! But I like that he was just like, I just want to give everything to the world.
But the man's greatest contributions to America, and eventually the world in general, would be his love of freedom and his support of the American effort to guide its own destiny. At least freedom for white men. Like all the founders, Franklin was a slave owner. He owned at least 7 people, and their names were Joseph, Jemima, Peter, King, Othello, George, and Bob. Peter and King would accompany him on his European trips, and were given a small salary. King ran away in 1758 and was found 2 years later, having been taken in by a Christian woman who taught him to read and write. Late in life, Franklin became a vocal abolitionist who urged Congress to do something about slavery.
So he at least finally got there, but I was so hoping, because they never talk much about him and slavery or anything like that, that I was hoping that he didn't have any, but that was not true. In 1754, he proposed a plan to unite the colonies under a national congress named the Plan of Union. And while none of the colonies agreed to the plan, elements of the Articles of Confederation would come from this. While in Europe in 1765, he rallied against passage of the Stamp Act of 1765. This law required that all legal documents, newspapers, books, playing cards, and other printed materials in the American colonies carry a tax stamp. That failed and the act passed, igniting the timbers of revolution. The cries of taxation without representation would begin. The House of Commons conducted proceedings later, and Franklin testified to have the Stamp Act repealed, and it was. With this success, Franklin became the leading spokesman for American interests in England. The colonies of Georgia, New Jersey, and Massachusetts appointed him as their agent to the crown.
Britain wasn't done with imposing regulations and bills to get more control of the colonies. Anti-British sentiments increased. And then the first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired in Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. Franklin was still in England at the time. His wife Deborah had begged him to come home for months. She was lonely and her health was failing. Deborah suffered several strokes and died in 1774 before the war started. It would be 5 months before Franklin returned to Philadelphia.
So he didn't even come back right after his wife died. I was like, geez.
Ben was selected to serve as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress. The Congress consisted of delegates from all 13 colonies, and they met in Philly to form the Continental Army, and elect George Washington as Commander-in-Chief and create the Articles of Confederation. They also try to prevent war with the Olive Branch Petition that they sent to King George III. This would be the American government from 1775 to 1783. The Declaration of Independence would be drafted and then ratified on July 4, 1776. Although Thomas Jefferson was given most of the credit for drafting the Declaration of Independence, there were 4 other men involved: John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert R. Livingston, and Benjamin Franklin. This would be the first of 4 key documents that established the United States that Franklin would sign. The others were the Treaty of Alliance with France, 1778, and the Treaty of Paris establishing peace with Great Britain, 1783, and the U.S. Constitution, 1787. He was the only man to sign all 4.
I thought that was pretty cool. Had his fingers and everything there. In 1776, Franklin was sent to France to get their help with the war. He got the French to sign a military alliance with America, and they sent money, soldiers, and supplies. Benjamin would become the minister to France starting in 1778, and he helped draft the document that brought the war to an end, the Treaty of Paris. As we said earlier, this was signed in 1783. 2 years later, Franklin returned from France, and in 1787, he was a Pennsylvania delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He was the oldest delegate at 81. Fellow delegate William Pierce said of Franklin that he was, quote, the greatest philosopher of the present age. He's 81 years old and possesses an activity of mind equal to a youth of 25. I hope I'm like that when I'm 81.
I think you will be.
Now, his brain was there, but the rest of his body wasn't. Since Philadelphia was hosting the convention, Franklin was the main host, and he came into the meetings much like a king. And it wasn't necessarily because they were treating him like a king. He was in very poor health, suffering debilitating pain from gout. He could not even walk at this point. So he had to be carried into the meeting sitting in a French sedan chair carried by 4 convicts. This is a chair like nobody had ever seen in America. So it was a very, very grand chair to be carried in. When the convention ended in September of 1787, he urged his fellow delegates to support the U.S. Constitution. It was ratified by the required 9 states in June 1788, and George Washington was inaugurated as America's first president in April 1789.
Franklin lived long enough to see all this come to fruition. It must have been a very gratifying end to a life spent in service. He was 84 when he passed away on April 17, 1790, in Philadelphia. There were 20,000 people at his funeral, and he was buried in Philadelphia's Christ Church Cemetery. He left money to his passions of science and education in his 2 favorite cities, Boston and Philadelphia. Community projects were funded, a trade school was established, scholarships were funded, and a science museum was founded. Franklin has been honored on stamps, schools and towns have been named for him, and most importantly, his face is on the $100 bill. Franklin Court in Philadelphia is home base for everything about Ben Franklin in Philadelphia. The Franklin Museum is here and features exhibits based on his character traits rather than a timeline or major events layouts, which is kind of how we organized this episode.
It's really hard to do stuff in a timeline way, which is usually when I write out these scripts, I kind of do it that way, like they're born and then we just move through their life. But he had so many different elements, it was doing so many different things, and you want to focus on all of it, that I just ended up kind of doing it that way. And then later on, when I got into reading about the museum and saw how they laid out the museum, I'm like, that's how I did the script, because that's kind of how you have to do it. So I thought that was kind of cool. The museum's the same way.
There is an actual working post office here, a recreated print shop with a working printing press, his toilet. Apparently his toilet's in the museum because he made upgrades to it, and what is referred to as a ghost house. His original home was torn down in 1812. When the Park Service acquired the property, they removed the row houses that had been built on the site and built an open-air structure that matches the dimensions of Franklin's house. There are also 70s-style concrete bunkers housing archaeological remnants of the original house and letters describing the house.
When I go to look up, because I wanted to know what those upgrades were to the toilet, there's apparently a company called Benjamin Franklin Plumbing, and they're talking about toilet upgrades, and now they apparently have self-cleaning toilets. I don't know how that works. Whip out a little brush and brush themselves. There's no such thing as a self-cleaning toilet. I'm sorry. I don't care what you do with it. I'm a cleaning lady. I know. Kelly, we also should mention that bones were found beneath the home that Franklin lived in on Craven Street in Britain.
Really? Tell me more.
I mean, I don't know if you've heard this story, but I heard this story years ago, and there was this big thing like, oh my God, there were bones of animals and adults and even children found under this home at Benjamin Franklin's house. Did they sacrifice him at the Hellfire Club and then bury him underneath the house? I mean, I know there were all these weird theories and conspiracy theories out there and stuff. What they found were 1,200 bone fragments. These were recovered by archaeologists. And it was determined that they probably were connected to an anatomy school that was run from the house by William Hewson, who was the son-in-law of the landlady, based on dissection marks that were on the bones. And of course, in order for them to have gotten these bodies, there was a graveyard nearby, so they figure that resurrection men or grave robbers probably brought some of these bodies over to them. They're believed to have been from 15 individuals, which did include a few children. Hewson died after contracting sepsis during a dissection. You have to be kind of careful when you're handling cadavers, and he was only 34 at the time. But he is considered, I think they call him the father of hematology or something, but there was this one experiment where he put mercury, I think, in a frog to show how the lymphatic system worked. So he really was the one who discovered the lymphatic system.
Wow.
So it's really cool. It's too bad that he died young like that, because who knows what else he would have come up with. And it is believed that this anatomy school was running out of there probably at the same time that Benjamin Franklin was there too, that he knew these people and maybe watched some of the dissections. I would probably think, since he had that kind of a mind, he would have wanted to see that kind of stuff. William Hewson left behind his wife. They had 2 children at the time, and she was pregnant with their third. So this was pretty awful for her. So I think Benjamin Franklin, since he was friends with the landlady and had been friends with William, he became friends with the widow as well. And I have a feeling he helped take care of them because, I mean, she was left with nothing. After the Revolutionary War, she did move with her 3 children over here to America so she could be near him. So as we were discussing, he had these really wonderful friendships with women. So I think this was another one of those that he had become very good friends with her and was probably helping to take care of her.
I have a fun fact. Franklin wrote the book Fart Proudly, and in there he said, "In digesting our common food, there is created or produced in the bowels of human creatures a great quantity of wind."
You know what, Kelly? I do have to say, I think human beings, they do make a great quantity of wind. I have to agree with Benjamin Franklin on that.
My.
And as 13-year-old boys, we do fart proudly.
Stop giving away all our secrets. That was a good one, Diane.
Thank you for sharing that fun fact, Mort.
My pleasure.
Benjamin Franklin had a big spirit, and perhaps that is why it is at unrest. His favorite haunt is Independence Hall, and that's not surprising since this was the birthplace of the United States and stands proudly as the centerpiece of Independence National Historic Park. The building was constructed in 1732 as the Pennsylvania State House, but loaned its assembly room out for meetings of the Second Continental Congress and eventually the Constitutional Convention. George Washington sat in a chair here for 3 months during the latter convention, and the chair was dubbed the Rising Sun Armchair. James Madison wrote into the Federal Record the sentiments of Franklin about this chair. Whilst the last members were signing it, the Constitution, Dr. Franklin looked towards the president's chair at the back of which a rising sun happened to be painted, observed to a few members near him that painters had found it difficult to distinguish in their art a rising from a setting sun. I have said he often and often in the course of the session and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. So I thought that was just a really cool analogy, is that, you know, I don't know if it was based on the color that he's like, I don't know, is that sun rising, setting? Hopefully it's not setting on our nation and that, you know, we're just going down. So I just thought it was a cool sentiment that he was like, it's rising. The full-bodied apparition of Franklin is most often seen in that assembly room. Franklin is often examining a copy of the Declaration of Independence when seen. I don't know how people know that, if they're like close enough to see what the document says on it. Because, I mean, the Constitution would look very similar as well.
I'm imagining it's probably on display, a copy of it, and that's where his spirit is seen.
Oh, that's a good point. I've never been to Independence Hall, so if any of you have and been in the assembly room, we'd love to know. Is the Declaration of Independence, I know it's not the original, but maybe a copy of it there somewhere on display, and maybe his spirit is looking down at it so people know that's what he's looking at. That would make sense. He's also been seen wandering other rooms as well. Many people describe his figure having a ghostly mist trailing behind it.
Another favorite spot for the ghost of Ben is the American Philosophical Society that he founded in 1743. This is the oldest learned society in the United States, and their collection of books, photographs, scientific instruments, paintings, and other things is extensive. In 1789, the society made Philosophical Hall its home. Beginning in the late 19th century, people began claiming to see the ghost of Franklin near the library of the society. And some really crazy accounts claim that the statue of Franklin that stands in front of the society has come to life and danced in the streets.
Now, I'm wondering how much did they have to drink before they saw that?
One person who had an experience in the society was a cleaning lady. She was in the library in 1884, and she said a ghostly figure rushed at her and knocked her over as it made its way towards the stacks. The description she gave of the apparition matched what Franklin looked like.
He was rushing to get a book. Get out of my way, madam. I've also heard the story told that it was a clerk, so I don't know for sure if it was a cleaning lady or clerk, but I chose cleaning lady, well, because, we're pretty cool. Spiritualists claim to hear from Ben Franklin a lot during seances. During the Victorian era, he was one of their stars, of course. An English medium named Mrs. Manley claimed to get a message from Franklin in 1872, and in it, he claimed to have invented the terrestrial telegraph. She wrote out the following message. On arriving in spirit life, having while on earth thought much upon the subject of electricity, I saw that the magnetic telegraph could be made a success to transmit news all over the earth and under the seas. At once I commenced looking for a human organism which I could impress to carry out what I so plainly saw could be done. I watched my opportunity, and when Professor Morse's father and mother came together in coition? Anyway, when they made a baby, I was there and projected my thought into the brain of the embryo child. So S.F.B. Morse was really my son more than the son of his earthly father. It's a hell of a claim. Now, I could see Benjamin
Right.
Franklin making that claim, and maybe even in the afterlife, but the thing is, Samuel Morse would go on to invent the telegraph, as we all know, and of course Morse code, and he was born a year after Franklin died, so it might have been possible. Okay. I don't know how those things would all go together, but of course we know that spiritualists were making up most of their stuff anyway, so I just thought that was a very interesting story.
Indeed. Benjamin Franklin was many things during his lifetime. Is one of those things now a ghost haunting his favorite places?
That is for you to decide. Well, like I said, he is one of my favorite founding fathers. He had a very distinctive look about him. Very, very interesting life. I'm sure he's having a very interesting afterlife, too. We probably don't know half the things he's doing. I'm actually surprised that there aren't reports of him giving the ladies a little pat on the tush while they're moving through the museum looking at his stuff.
Agreed.
We'd love to have you guys go check out our website at historygoesbump.com. And if you'd like to send us some feedback, you can do that at historygoesbump@gmail.com. We love getting your comments on our various social media as well. And over on Patreon, we did hear from Cindy, and this is under Fort McHenry. She said, my mom learned that we are related to Francis Scott Key, so I grew up with facts of the Star-Spangled Banner. Key wrote a few more poems that were transferred to song lyrics, and I think at least one is in the Lutheran hymnal. And then she'd wondered about the Spirit Box recording, if it was saying parson instead of person, maybe a parson visiting for last rites or counseling.
Oh.
But I did tell her the Spirit Box actually would print out the words too, and it did have the word person, so.
Gotcha.
But parson certainly is interesting as well. And then she also added a little bit later, my mom's hobby was family history, so I grew up going cemetery stomping and researching. I love it, and I have a lot of relations to American Revolutionary times. That's very cool.
Yeah, very cool.
My family immigrated long after that, so I don't have a long history in America. And then also under Fort McHenry, Amanda had commented, I never thought of the star shape of some forts possibly having to do with the hauntings. Interesting theory. And then she thanked us for sharing her comment about Haunted Wall Street and being amazed about bog butter. I want to thank you guys for joining us on this episode. I've been your host, Diane.
And this has been Kelly.
You take care now. Bye-bye. This episode is brought to you by our executive producers.
Check out the website at historygoesbump.com.
Doing a quick test. Check.
Check one.
You act like you're getting up on stage and going to perform a song or something. We're History Goes Bump groupies.
Is there a way to pivot it like this a little bit? I don't want to break anything. Is that? Oh, okay. This joint does move. Okay. Well, I was afraid I was going to break something, but then I could see the line of this material inside here.
Well, all this stuff that you're talking about is because I got these new fandangled microphone holders.
Not fandangled, fantastic.
Yeah, whatever. I like using words that aren't really words.
Irregardless.
Yes. Anyway, isn't this cool to have the new mic holders?
It is.
It only took me 10 years to get there.
I know. Smack. A couple years before that, Franklin became the owner and publisher of the Pavilion.
It's not Pennsylvania anymore. We're going to start calling you Pavilion. That's much more interesting than Pennsylvania.
It's Pazuki.
I don't even know where that came from.
Well, I tried to blend Pennsylvania and Gazette.
And you got Pavilion?
Yes.
That sounds more like the made-up words that people make for like $1 gazillion.